Fred is, how long have you been with New York? So why don't you just give us a little elevator speech on Fred Dixon?
Sure, it'll be short and sweet.
Short and sweet.
So I've been at NYC Company since 2005. I joined the team as the Vice President of Tourism, and we had the remit in the beginning of building our international network. So we set about building our global representation team. We went from 6 international offices to 19 in a period of about 3 years, which was pretty remarkable. And we've seen international market grow over that time, and it's been a terrific run. In 2013, I was fortunate to be able to move into the CEO role, where I've been since that time. And so it's hard to believe it's been almost 8 years in that space, but it's been a terrific honor and never boring, certainly in New York, especially in these times. But it's wonderful to see things start to turn around.
On that note, I mean, so full disclosure, I lived in Manhattan for 14 years before moving to Florida. And as damning as the pandemic was for all of tourism and all the economy, I think particularly, New York particularly was hard hit in lots of different ways. But I have to say this, and I'm afraid it's going to sound wrong, but I think you'll understand what I mean by it. When I saw some of the images of people walking alone down Fifth Avenue, or completely, and I saw people, friends of mine would send me videos of themselves walking in these places and just taking long strolls with drinks in the streets. There was something very soothing and odd about it. It was dystopian, don't get me wrong, but there was almost like a playground mentality among. Did you experience any of that personally?
Yeah, it was surreal, actually. I mean, in the early days of the pandemic when things were, shutting down, and I know everyone experienced it in their own ways, you just couldn't believe what you were actually seeing. And living in Manhattan, you don't normally need a car, and I haven't had a car in a very long time. I went into a slight panic and leased a car sight unseen so I could have some wheels in case I needed to move out of the city. And at night, when I would finish work, I would get in the car and drive around Manhattan, which you would never do. You'd have to be out of your mind to want to leisurely drive around Manhattan. And it was unbelievable to drive through the streets of Midtown, in particular, Rockefeller Center, Times Square, drive around Central Park, and you would go blocks and not see another person. So it's been quite a journey through all of that, and I'm happy to say the city is back in a big way. We keep setting sort of new pandemic records week after week. Now Broadway is open, and we're very optimistic.
Talk to me about the Central Park concert. That was so cool.
Yeah.
And then it rained on Barry Manilow. Barry Manilow, I got to mention him again, right? We saw him last night. But that was, I think that really spoke to did you guys have anything to do with that, or was that, it was you guys?
Yeah. So it was the city of New York and Clive Davis. Clive Davis was born and raised in Brooklyn, and so he wanted to do something for the city in the recovery, and he, of course, is famous for his talent pool, and so he called the mayor and said, I'd like to do a concert. And Danny Meyer, who is the founder of Shake Shack, but also one of our greatest restaurateurs in New York with Gramercy Tavern and Union Square Cafe and others, is the chair of the Economic Development Board. And he had proposed this idea early on in the pandemic of, when the moment is right, let's have a homecoming in New York for everyone who grew up here, everyone who loves New York, and invite them back into the city. So those two ideas came together. There was a series of events at the end of August that culminated in this Central Park concert with Clive Davis, and we almost got through it. We got through 2.5 of 4 hours of live broadcast on CNN before the hurricane swooped in on us. But
it's crazy.
I was there, and Barry, I think he was singing Mandy, actually, when he got cut off. He didn't quite get to. We made it through the rain. But it was quite a night. And I don't know if any of you got to watch any of it or see any of the coverage. You think it would be a big disappointment that the last hour and a half of the concert was canceled, and it certainly was, because there were huge acts that did not get to perform. People like Patti Smith and Paul Simon and Bruce Springsteen and Maluma was there, and others. But to watch, because I recorded it and I went back to the apartment after I dried out and watched it, but to see Anderson Cooper and all of the talent call in from their tents and just sort of wax, philosophical about New York and the whole experience for 3 hours was advertising you really couldn't pay for. So it actually ended up all right. It
was awesome. I hope they finance the second half of that concert sometime this summer or later.
There are talks about finishing the concert. Great. Yeah.
So this is the last moments of Thrive, and Thrive is, of course, LGBTQ plus concerns, marketing, and all angles of it. And you are, you're responsible for the brand of probably one of the gayest places ever. What is, I mean, how do you separate the gay from the New York, and do you even need to in New York?
Yeah.
You understand the question, right?
I do,
yeah.
I do. I thought Key West was the gayest place on earth. But we'll take that, absolutely.
Okay,
right. It's interesting, and this has actually been a real sort of earnest conversation amongst our team over the last many years. When you think about branding New York, and we talk about diversity and inclusivity, and particularly as it relates to LGBTQ+, and how do you separate the two, and should you separate the two? And the decision we've come to basically over the many years is you don't separate the two. In fact, New York is welcoming of everyone, and New York is one of those places that a lot of young gay people, male, female, non-binary, run to. They run to, obviously, big cities in many ways because it's a place where you can find your community, you can find your new family, you can feel at home, and you can express yourself. And that is true of the LGBTQ+ community, but it's also true of pretty much any immigrant community on the planet. New York is the most diverse city in the United States, and growing all the time. Oh, look at this. I like a program with champagne.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sherry. Yes, you do. So we basically have decided, over the years that, you should never separate those messages. New York is one of the most welcoming places on the planet, and you have to celebrate it as such. And over the last couple of years, and particularly the last year with the social reckoning of last summer with the murder of George Floyd, we really knew that, one message was resounding clearly for us, and that was that we have to lean in more. We thought we were doing enough in many ways as it related to diversity and inclusivity. We'd hosted World Pride in 2019. Thank God we got that out of the way before the pandemic hit. God bless Copenhagen. They just hosted it. So it's every 2 years, of course. And I understand they did a great job. But we had 5 million people in New York for World Pride. It was the largest Pride event ever on the planet. It was amazing. I don't know if any of you were there. Yep. It was a sight to see. And David, you were there, I think. Yep. And so, we learned a lot of lessons from that. And one of the lessons is that you never can talk enough about diversity and inclusivity. And your brand should not shy away from it. You should lean into it at every opportunity. So for us, it was a real evolution point. And last summer was another evolution point. Brands are living things, and they have to grow and they have to evolve. And we've doubled down on our diversity and inclusivity over the last year in New York, and we'll continue to do so as we go forward. So it's been a great honor to help lead those conversations.
You've touched on something that you're the perfect person to ask this, because I wonder a lot, the destination marketer in me and the New York lover in me. Brand is something you don't control. It's what people think of you. You can do your best to sway the brand in one way or another. Is 9/11 part of the New York brand?
Yeah, that's interesting. And of course, we just came through the 20th anniversary of 9/11 just last week. And it is, New York is, the part of the New York story is that the city has been through a lot of tumult, right? It has been through so much over the years. It's been through hurricanes, it's been through wars, it's been through economic strife, it's been through, financial disasters, whether it was the Great Depression or whether it was the recession in 2008 and 9. And the city always bounces back. And so one of the things that's very true about the New York City brand is that it always endures. And there's sort of a story, a sort of an urban legend of how people are always trying to write the obituary of New York. And that's true, I think, of any brand that is in the lead, as it were. The obituary of New York has been written a million times, and it's never proven true. And so that's one of the great brand assets, I think, of the destination that really, I think, appeals to people in so many ways, because it's a city with enormous heart. It's a city with an enormous community. New Yorkers can be really tough on the outside, but they really care about each other and really look out for each other. In moments of crisis is when the city comes together. I don't know about you, but over the weekend of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, watching all the documentaries and all the footage is just a humbling reminder of that day and how our community came together. And so it is indelibly part of our brand, and it always will be. And we shy away from, talking about it a lot because it is a painful moment for a lot of people. But we never miss an opportunity to commemorate the anniversary. We never miss an opportunity to talk about the recovery and what it meant for the city. New York was one of the first destinations to actually come back strong after 9/11, ironically. Everyone was quick to write off Lower Manhattan and saying that, no one will ever live downtown again. No one will ever live or work in tall buildings again. And you look where we are today. We have overcome all of those obstacles, and we've learned to build back better and stronger. And we know that New York is always going to be a target. That is just the way of the world. And so we're fortunate to have an incredibly dedicated police force in New York and a security force that keep us safe and stay on top of their game 24/7. So it is part of our brand, and I think it always should be.
What is the 9/11 Memorial a very heavily touristed? Is it a tourist attraction? Is it bona fide?
Yeah, and it's interesting because we debated actually, do you put it in the attraction category, right? I mean, that's a deep question. It's the National 9/11 Memorial and Museum. There's the memorial itself, which is at ground level, which is the two fountains. Hopefully you all have seen those in the footprints of the two towers. But down below grade is the museum itself, which goes all the way down to bedrock to what they call the bathtub right after 9/11. It is one of the most visited sites in the city. The memorial itself certainly is. Fewer people go into the museum because, somewhat like the Holocaust Museum in Washington, it isn't necessarily a journey everyone wants to go on because it is a very emotional one. But the museum is incredibly well done, and it is one of the most visited museums in the city for sure.
Take a broad brush, if you will, and just give me a couple of keywords for each of the boroughs. The one thing that's exciting about New York is how the boroughs are just always like complementing Manhattan, but also kind of sucking part of the oxygen out of Manhattan. And it seems to be this internal, they're like frenemies almost. Walk us through your perspective of how all those, how they all get along.
Yeah, and this is a lesson you have to learn when you come to New York. And of course, I was raised in a small town in Tennessee, and I came to New York right after 9/11. And so learning the dynamics and the politics of the boroughs has been a journey. And those politics are always evolving and changing as well. There's a few truths, though, I think is what you're pointing to about the boroughs. And Manhattan is what everyone calls the city, right? If you grew up in New York, or if you live in New York and you live outside of Manhattan, you refer to Manhattan as the city oftentimes. And so we have to be careful as destination marketers oftentimes when we talk about the city. Locals interpret that as, oh, you're just focusing on Manhattan. But for you, when you think about New York City, you obviously are thinking probably about the skylines if you're not from New York. But you also are thinking about Queens and Brooklyn and Staten Island and the Bronx as well. So the city is always Manhattan. That's local local truth, and it is for a lot of visitors as well. Brooklyn, of course, is arguably one of the hippest places on the planet. Brooklyn has a pride that is, I think, unmatched. It has its own amazing brand, which is interesting, and it sometimes eclipses the New York City brand itself. Brooklyn has a cachet and a swagger to it that is organic and unique. I don't think you could ever invent that on your own. And so it's interesting sometimes when we have to position and balance the brands within the city of New York against one another because they can outshine one another at times. So it is, as a destination marketer, it's a constant sort of struggle. But so Brooklyn was at one time its own city. It was absorbed into the city of New York, and the Brooklynites have never forgotten that. They were their own city. They, of course, and it's interesting too, there's so much, I'm a history nerd, so there's so much you can go into, but if you live in Brooklyn and someone writes you a letter, they will write Brooklyn, New York, right? Brooklyn is a city within the city of New York, in a sense. But Queens is not like that. You wouldn't write a letter to someone's address in Queens and write Queens, New York. But Brooklyn you do, because Brooklyn still maintains its own postal designation as a city, which is interesting. Then, of course, you have Staten Island, which is the most conservative of the 5 boroughs, by and large, politically. Staten Island has a real mix of immigrant communities, but it's known for its long history of sort of Irish-American residents, and a lot of police officers and firemen live on Staten Island.
And for Pete Davidson, right?
And for Pete Davidson and Wu-Tang Clan. But Staten Island is the borough that is least visited by visitors. We now have the Empire Outlets there, and there's a couple of amazing culturals there that are now getting more attention. One of them including Alice Austin House, which was she was a noted photographer in the mid-20th century, a lesbian who had her own style of photography, and her home is now a museum. And that's one of the jewels, in my opinion, certainly of Staten Island. But you have Snug Harbor and the St. George Theater and historic Richmond Town. So many cool places to see in Staten Island. Queens is the most diverse of all the boroughs, right?
And it seems to be the hottest right now. Like everything seems to be going on in Queens, right?
100%. And Queens is always, there's a rivalry between Queens and Brooklyn. As destination marketers, our job is ultimately to bring economic activity into the community from outside, but we also try to encourage New Yorkers to explore their own city, this notion of local tourism. And I can tell you, it's easier to get someone to travel from France to New York than it is sometimes to get somebody from Brooklyn to go to Queens. They have their sibling rivalry there.
And they've got their own road, the BQE, right? It's Brooklyn Queens.
It's the Brooklyn Queens Expressway. And Queens has a fierce identity in its own right. They all do, but Queens prides itself in its diversity, certainly in the immigrant population that's there. It is one of the most dynamic boroughs today, as you pointed out. It's certainly having its moment. It is Long Island City and the story, if you haven't been there in some time and seen the growth of both of those downtown locations, it's just remarkable as to what's happening. Queens is also the home to our two airports, so LaGuardia and JFK both sit in Queens. But Queens is an enormous borough and it wraps all the way around Brooklyn. So Brooklyn is sort of isolated by the water, and Queens wraps around Brooklyn almost entirely. And then you have the Bronx, of course. The Bronx is, one of the most storied places in New York. The Bronx has seen, good times and bad times. The famous line from Howard Cosell that the Bronx is burning is something that I think has been, talk about brand and tragic history. That moment and that language stuck in the minds of a lot of people all over America and all over the world, that the Bronx was a place you wouldn't want to go. But I'm happy to tell you that the Bronx is not only the greenest borough, because it has the most and largest parks in our city, but it is one of the most vibrant communities. It's about to have its own renaissance in so many ways. We just announced the construction of the first hip-hop museum in America, because hip-hop was born in the Bronx. It is our own music, and it is something that we are celebrating, and you're going to hear more from us about the hip-hop story and the evolution of music in the Bronx. Of course, the Yankee Stadium and the Bronx Bombers. Right. The Bronx is memorialized in so many amazing ways, but it's home to our zoo, it's home to the New York Botanical Gardens, and it's just a remarkable place with its own diversity. And then Manhattan itself has a remarkable amount of diversity from top to bottom. The bottom, of course, is Battery Park and the financial district of Wall Street and 9/11, and then as you work your way up through Tribeca and Soho and Chinatown, and you work your way into sort of Midtown, then, of course, you have the Upper East and the Upper West. Then you have Harlem itself, which is storied in its own right and arguably one of the biggest brands in travel in the world. And then you move into Washington Heights, and you move, into Morningside Heights, and then Washington Heights and Inwood. There's amazing diversity and cultural immersion.
There's just
uptown.
So much. I mean, your job to market, to bring one brand to that diversity is pretty stunning. And diversity is what this is about. And we're going to end with one question and then a little salute. But part of diversity is, and we talked about this with Carson as well, is sustainability. And what, the warming and the sea level rise and whatnot. And I know you're aware as well, New York City famously has had 2 of its highest rainfall days in the last 2 months it has had ever. What is the awareness level on the ground in New York about what can be done? Are steps being taken right now to address the rising sea level on any level in Manhattan? And just a short answer. I don't want to get into your in too deep, but no pun intended. But what's happening?
Yeah, and you saw it with the concert, right? I mean, the concert was rained out. That was one of the heaviest rainfall days in history. But yes, it is. There's incredible awareness on the ground in New York of the need for climate change dialogue and water protection. I mean, we are a water city. We're surrounded on all sides by water. We saw with Hurricane Sandy, what can happen when the floodways, the subways in Lower Manhattan were flooded, and homes, and certainly Staten Island took a tremendous beating from that storm. And then just recently from Ida, we saw the flooding in Queens, in particular with apartment buildings that had ground floor or garden apartments that were flooded. And so our cities, particularly ones with old infrastructure like New York, are finding remarkable challenges when it comes to managing it. So there is dialogue at every level. There's dialogue about building a seawall and where it will be, but we have firmed up the waterfronts of every borough in building berms, and you see them now as parks largely, which is really a nice outcome. But there are...
New York City and company is part of that conversation.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And in fact, next week, or this week actually, today is Sunday, right? So this is Climate Week, right, coming up. And so we're hosting a 2-day program on Tuesday and Wednesday called The Nest at the Javits Center. This is our 5th year of a Sustainability and Climate Change Conference. We had 100 climate thought leaders to speak at the program last year. Over 1 million consumers were engaged in the dialogue about climate change and its impact on urban cities like New York, but also the society as a whole. So there's immense focus on it. We have to do something to protect our waterfront cities. We also have to do something to protect, the West, where there's enormous drought. So, there's an enormous need and not enough answers at the moment, but we're helping lead that dialogue.
That's happy to hear. And the last thing we'll end on is a positive note. I know Broadway reopened, and that's slow going, but it's coming along. What shows reopened, and what's the schedule moving forward?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's an exciting moment. And has anyone seen a Broadway show yet? Yes, my New Yorkers in the room. I got to be at the opening night of Lackawanna Blues Tuesday night, which was Ruben Santiago's own story, and it's a one-man show. And I tell you, there were tears when that curtain came up. It was just so emotional to be there. Bruce Springsteen led the way in June. He brought his one-man show back to Broadway in June. We had 2 shows that opened later in August, including Passover, which is a celebrated new play by a black playwright. We had Hadestown and Waitress open up at the beginning of September, and then just this past week, the biggies started to open. So Hamilton, Wicked, Lion King, Chicago, Lackawanna Blues had their opening. And then now we're going into sort of every week or to 2 weeks, you're going to see more and more shows open up. There are 41 Broadway theaters in New York. And in Broadway, you may know this, a little bit of trivia is defined by houses with seats of 500 or more. So there are 41 theaters with 500 seats or more. And I can tell you by spring, 40 of those theaters will be in use. So we're really excited. We'll have 40 Broadway shows on the boards by spring. And there's incredible excitement in the community. There's a lot of new work that's being presented, an incredible focus on black playwrights and Latin playwrights. They've been prioritized and moved up the list, which was long needed. And I'm really happy about that. Thoughts of a Colored Man is one of the new pieces that's being presented, a play that's opening in previews on October 1st, and I'll be there to see that.
That's awesome, Fred. We could talk New York for a whole week and not get halfway through it. Thank you for being here. I hope you have a great show, and long live New York and the boroughs too, right? And Manhattan is a borough, right? They always forget it's a borough, right?
Yep.
We would like to take this moment, everyone's got it in front of them, and say thank you to the group who stuck with us for 2 days. Thank you to all of our sponsors. We have Brand USA, Cedar Rapids, Communify, Elemental Experience, Kissimmee, Key West, Miami, Student Youth Travel Association, Pandora, Sirius, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. And of course, our premier sponsor, the Gay Travel Business Network, and DJ Dorn and that crew there. So we say a toast to everybody here. Here's to Thrive. It's the little show that could, and we will see you all next time. Thanks for coming out. Cheers.